This treaty is a simple document. The nations which sign it agree to abide by the peaceful principles of the United Nations, to maintain friendly relations and economic cooperation with one another, to consult together whenever the territory or independence of any of them is threatened, and to come to the aid of any one of them who may be attacked.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or the NATO, was created in 1949 by the United States, Canada, and several Western European nations. Its objective was to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. 75 years later, the organization is going through its biggest test. And surprisingly, even after all these years, against its biggest opponent, Russia. This is the secretive surveillance flight called Airborne Warning and Control System, or the AWACS aircraft. NATO operates a fleet of these Boeing aircraft that keep a close watch on Russia and Ukraine. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its third year, NATO continues to provide Ukraine with unprecedented support and condemns Russia's brutal war of aggression. But how effective has it been against Russia in the last 2 years? With NATO celebrating 75 years on the 4th of April 2024, the big question is, what's at stake for NATO? The accession of Sweden and Finland mark the most significant additions to the alliance in decades. NATO has bolstered its defenses in Eastern Europe. Its expansion now includes 32 members, 20 more than its original number of 12.
The history of Europe has been one of, perpetual conflict. Up until the realization of NATO 75 years ago in 1949, which has maintained a really durable peace within the Euro-Atlantic zone. So that, to me, I think more so than anything else, is the historic nature of the accomplishment.
Will NATO expand further? What are its challenges amid the Russia-Ukraine war? Who funds NATO? Will Ukraine ever become part of the alliance? And what will happen to it if Donald Trump is re-elected President of the United States in November? Will NATO's future be fraught with challenges? Let's find out. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created by 12 countries from Europe and North America on the 4th of April in 1949. Its founding member countries were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
For us, war is not inevitable. We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep men one way or another. In our own time, we've seen brave men overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose.
Since the foundation, 20 more countries joined NATO through 10 rounds of enlargement. At present, NATO has 32 member countries across Europe and North America. NATO exists to defend its member countries and their 1 billion citizens. These countries, called NATO allies, are sovereign states that come together to discuss political and security issues and make collective decisions by consensus. NATO's purpose is to safeguard the freedom and security of all its members by political and military means. Collective defense is at the heart of the alliance, and it creates a spirit of solidarity among its members. So what does collective defense mean? NATO allies see it enshrined in Article 5 of their founding treaty. It says, "An armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all." But despite its preeminence, Article 5 has been invoked only once in NATO history. This was in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The day after 9/11, NATO invoked a mutual defense clause in its founding treaty, committing its members to stand by the United States against the attacks by the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda.
This attack was directed from abroad against the United States. It shall be regarded as an action covered by Article 5 of the Washington Treaty.
On October 2, 2001, NATO Secretary General Lord Robertson pledged the support of the 18 NATO allies in the campaign against international terrorism. NATO allies went into Afghanistan after the terrorist attacks against the United States to ensure the country will not become a haven for international terrorists again to attack NATO member countries. Over the last 2 decades, there have been no terrorist attacks on the Allied soil from Afghanistan. The United States launched the war in Afghanistan following the terrorist attacks. The conflict lasted 2 decades and spanned 4 US presidencies, becoming the longest war in American history. From August 2003, NATO led the UN-mandated International Security Assistance Force, or ISAF. The ISAF created the conditions to allow the Afghan government to exercise its authority throughout the country and rebuild the Afghan National Security Forces. The ISAF became fully functional in December 2014, when the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces assumed full responsibility for security across their country. But in 2021, the tables turned. In February 2020, the United States and the Taliban signed an agreement on the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan by May 2021. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul following a cascading crisis triggered by the Western military withdrawal and took over major parts of the country. The government and the Afghan National Security Forces collapsed, leading to the rise of the Taliban once again. Britain's former Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said NATO was a political failure in Afghanistan. American and NATO soldiers were in Afghanistan for 20 years, but surprisingly, even after 2 decades, no long-term solution was ever found to the NATO, eventually leaving the country, which is why analysts consider it NATO's biggest security failure.
The city of London.
When World War II ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. An estimated 15 million to 20 million people had lost their lives. World War II was the most destructive war in human history. It changed the landscape of international relations forever. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two global superpowers and rivals on the international stage, and the Cold War began. In 1949, to secure peace and stability in Europe and to check communist expansion, the United States and 11 other Western nations decided to form the NATO. The alliance was to be a counterweight to the Soviet armies stationed in Central and Eastern Europe after World War II. The formation of the NATO spurred the Soviet Union to create an alliance with the communist governments of Eastern Europe. This was formalized in 1995 by the Warsaw Pact. It was the Soviet Union's equivalent response to NATO. The Warsaw Pact had 8 members. After the Cold War, NATO was recognized as a cooperative security organization with a mandate of 2 main objectives. One was to foster dialogue and cooperation with former adversaries in the Warsaw Pact, and to manage conflicts in areas on the European periphery, like the Balkans. In 1991, after the disintegration of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. That same year, the North Atlantic Cooperation Council was created as a platform for cooperation between old Warsaw Pact members and the NATO. So, how does NATO fund itself? NATO's funding comes from the direct and indirect contributions from member nations. All allies use an agreed cost-share formula derived from the gross national income of member countries. This is the principle of common funding and demonstrates the burden sharing in action. The members of the military alliance pledge to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense per year by 2024. Through these funds, NATO is expected to run its military commands. The alliance also has its own military budget worth $2.18 billion that is used to fund some operations and the NATO Strategic Command Center, as well as training and research. It also has a civilian budget of 438 million euros, or $475 million. This budget is used to fund the NATO headquarters in Belgium. In 2023, only 11 member countries were on track to meet their NATO target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. The US accounted for 68% of the total defense expenditures of NATO countries. Measured in absolute terms, this is over 10 times more than the second-placed country, Germany. However, the spending in terms of GDP, the US is in second place with a spending of 3.5% of their GDP, behind Poland's defense spending of $29.1 billion, or 3.9% of its GDP. This table shows 15 member countries and their funding towards NATO in 2023, according to their GDP percentage. Meeting the defense spending target set by NATO is complicated. The economic condition of a country fluctuates. While some countries commit to spending more, these commitments are not always completed if the head of state does not have the power to fulfill them. Some nations in NATO are wealthy but small and meet their commitments in other ways. Since its inception in 1949, the United States has played a leading role in the funding and the operations of the NATO. However, the relationship between the two has seen its fair share of ups and downs. In 2018, the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, plunged one of the NATO summits into chaos. Trump threatened to pull out of the alliance if the European countries failed to boost their spending to at least 2% of GDP by January 2019.
23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
Fast forward to 2024, Trump once again made news when he said the US will remain in NATO if he gets re-elected, as long as the European countries play fair.
Because what I'm saying is that's a form of negotiation. Why should we guard these countries that have a lot of money and the United States was paying for most of NATO?
If they start to play fair, America's there.
Yes, 100%, 100%.
If the United States pulls out of NATO, the consequences could be destabilizing. Without the backing of the United States, the alliance will lose its most powerful military force and strategic leader. This will also benefit Russia and its leader, Vladimir Putin. Although a US withdrawal remains unlikely, any weakening of US commitments to NATO change global security, weakening the West as a geopolitical concept. In March this year, Sweden officially joined NATO as its 32nd member, almost 2 years after it first applied to the military alliance. Sweden now benefits from the alliance's common defense guarantee, under which an attack on a member is regarded as an attack on all. Russia's invasion of Ukraine forced Sweden to rethink its national security policy. The Scandinavian nation concluded that support for the alliance was the best guarantee of its safety. Russia's decision to invade Ukraine also prompted Finland to become an official member of NATO last April. The accession of Sweden and Finland, that shares a 1,340-kilometer border with Russia, are the most significant additions in decades.
I think it's also something that is quite a strong strategic marker of the strategic failure of Russia in its attack on Ukraine. When Finland and Sweden, I don't have a map, but you can envision it properly, when Sweden and Finland moves into NATO, you can realize that it completely changes the geometry of the battlefield. And it creates a northern flank that is way more coherent and much stronger. Today, the Baltic Sea, there's an expression calling it is a NATO lake, and that's exactly it.
The addition of Sweden wasn't easy. NATO members Hungary and Turkey delayed Sweden's accession, with both nations only voting in its favor this year. A key condition is that all existing members must approve a new country joining the alliance. Let's understand how countries join the alliance. The admission of a new member to the alliance involves various steps. Step 1. Once a country is invited to join the alliance by all its members, a formal process of accession talks begins. This involves discussions to determine if an invitee meets the requirements of the NATO membership. There are various eligibility criteria the countries have to fulfill to receive an invitation to join NATO. Step 2. The letter of intent is sent to the NATO Secretary General. Step 3. Accession protocols are assigned by NATO members. This step allows an invitee to become a party to the Washington Treaty that formed NATO. Step 4. Accession protocols ratified by NATO member governments according to their national procedures. Post this, accession protocols ratified by NATO member governments and later the Secretary General to accede to the treaty. As a final step, the invitee country needs to adopt and deposit its bill of ratification to join NATO. Once a ratification bill is officially passed, the country becomes a NATO member. Since the Russian invasion in 2022, Ukraine has made efforts to join NATO. Last year, at the NATO summit in Vilnius Lukishsk Square, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appeared on a stage. Emblazoned with the blue and yellow of Ukraine's flag and a huge sign reading #UkraineNato33. Zelensky asked for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO as soon as possible. NATO membership is far more significant than military hardware, but it may be some time before Kyiv's wish is granted. After extensive deliberation on the West's apparent lack of will to set up a timeline for Ukraine to join NATO, a consensus was reached at last year's summit. The G7 decided to give security guarantees to Ukraine till it joined the alliance. Subsequently, at least 25 European countries agreed to sign security deals with Kyiv. As of now, it seems that till the war ends, the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO seems remote, regardless of repeated commitments to its open-door policy.
As this conflict continues, and as more and more Europeans in particular recognize that the war in Ukraine is existential to them as well, how can we collectively as NATO allies make sure that we provide the right level of support to Ukraine in the long haul, which is a very demanding task, while not escalating this into a direct confrontation with Russia. So that's a bit of a thin line to walk.
Ukraine is running short of ammunition as it battles to hold off the Russian advances, fueling fears that a defensive collapse could see Putin's forces closing in on Kyiv once again. For their part, European nations have struggled to maintain unity, bickering over the kind of equipment to provide and whether to consider sending troops into Ukraine. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron sparked tensions within the Allies a few weeks ago, warning that the European Union will face an existential threat of a Russian invasion unless Vladimir Putin's forces are defeated in Ukraine. Italy's Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini accused French President Emmanuel Macron of endangering Europe by refusing to rule out sending Western ground troops to Ukraine. Amid all this, Putin has warned that NATO risks a nuclear conflict if it sends troops to aid Ukraine. And not just that, ahead of the alliance's 75th anniversary, Russia says NATO has reverted to the Cold War-era mindset. For 75 years, NATO has provided security assurances to its members. But questions are now being raised about its future. A lot will be at stake for NATO in the coming days.